Well, welcome back. This is part 2 of our series on Russia, a historical survey of faith. Last week, Pastor Pete took us from the beginnings of the Rus Empire, or Rus lands, with Prince Rurik being asked to come in and bring together the tribes. And he took us all the way through Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth. He wasn't so terrible. Okay, he was terrible, but today, we're going to take a look at, we're going to pick it up from Ivan, and we're going to run through about 300 years of Russian history in less than an hour. Should be no problem. Not much happened. No. And then we'll get back, we'll go right up to the Russian Revolution, and then next week we'll pick it up from there. But there we go. The Rurik dynasty is what was leading, in charge, reigning in Russia up to this point through Ivan. And then we have a new dynasty that's going to start up, the Romanov dynasty, but there's going to be a little trouble before that. So let's jump on the outline and let's see what happened here. So after the death of Ivan the Terrible, that was in 1584, and he reigned for 51 years, so chance to do a lot of things, both bad and good, but definitely secured the monarchy, the reign there. But unfortunately, there was a period of succession problems because he killed his oldest son, that was the one that was ready to rule, in a fit of rage. And there was a period of succession problems because of that, wars, economic difficulties, and social struggles. So Ivan killed his heir in a fit of rage, which left the empire to his weak and mentally challenged son. That's not how they write it in the books, but I, being politically correct, wrote mentally challenged. That was Fyodor the First. He would be the last Rurik, Fyodor would. So that ends the Rurik dynasty that was started by Prince Rurik. So it's like 600 years prior to this. So Fyodor there, you can see 1584 to 1598. He really was ruling through his father-in-law, which is Boris Godunov there. You've probably heard that name. But there's just the line of succession, just to give you an idea of what happened with Boris, 1598 to 1605. Then Fyodor II, 1605. Then we had a false Dmitri from 1605 to 1606. You had all these men that were coming up that were claiming they were part of the royal line. Dmitri was a child from a different part of the line, and it really wasn't him. It was just people would say these things. They'd gather a following, and then they would try and take over. So they had to fight that off. And then Vasily Shuisky in 1606 to 1610, and then you had an interregnum. So you had a period of time where there was no czar ruler in Russia. The nobles and the military were really running things until Mikhail I in 1613, and then his son Alexei. So there's Ivan the Terrible. That's a painting of Ivan the Terrible killing his son, Ivan also. You can see that well enough, yeah. His remorse. He did feel bad about it. That's what the historians say. But he would go through these fits of rage. At least he felt bad, right? All right. So there's Fyodor. You see, even the artists make him look look at those eyes, and yeah, just kind of didn't make him good. And then there's Boris Godunov on the other side of him there. Boris is he's got the three main things, the crown, that scepter, and then the ball. So, and you'll see that in a lot of the czars, until it was redesigned for Catherine, the Great. She redesigned that. She didn't. Apparently, it was too the crown especially was too male, so she created her own. So back on the outline. So Fyodor, he ruled through his father-in-law Boris Godunov, who was eventually elected Tsar when Fyodor I died in 1598. So Boris is loosely linked to the line. I believe I have the timeline. Okay. No, I don't have the timeline up there. Thought I did. It's probably later. So he's loosely linked to the family, and he inherited some pretty tough stuff. He came in, and you can see there he had to deal with a 3-year famine that killed 2 million people. That was a third of the population at the time. He had to deal with the false Tsar claimants that I mentioned up there, and there was more than one. There was a couple actually. And then an invasion by Poland. And Poland actually came in and took Moscow and was ruling there. And let me see there. That's what this map is. So you can see, when you get it, you'll see it. But all these lines represent different invasions by Poland and the false Dimitris and the other false Tsars, and lands that were taken away. So they were in a bad spot at this point in time. There was a lot of bad things going on, and by the time they get through to this past this interregnum period, and they get Mikhail, which we'll talk about in a second, it was they needed to do some bolstering. But back on the outline, so the Orthodox Church at this time, by Boris Godunov, he granted a much more increased independence, and he established a self-governing patriarchal see in Moscow. It was headed by what they called a metropolitan, or what we would call a patriarch, and they continue to call them patriarchs after that, but you'll see that term around as well. And this position was equal in authority in a sense to the Tsar. And this began this patriarchal period in Russia from 1589 to 1700. The church at this time succeeded in getting its land, so it had a lot of lands. It got it exempted from taxation, and it really became a state within a state. It had its own power. We think of the Vatican, right? The Vatican is a state within a state, a country within a country. It's a sovereign. The church acted a lot like that in Russia. It had a lot of power at this time. And Moscow was considered the third Rome, I put that in quotes, as the new center of Orthodox Christianity. I put this up. I mean, this is a map of the schism of 1054 between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. But you got Rome that was sacked by the Goths in the 6th century. It was defeated again in the 1500s by the Holy Roman Emperor coming down from the north. You had the schism in 1054. You had that Unite 1439. You had the Greek Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, trying to unite with the Roman Catholic Church, trying to see if they could get things back together, which ended up, they came to an agreement, but the Eastern Orthodox people came back to their countries, and the people didn't like it, so that didn't actually happen. That'll be important later on, so keep that in mind. And then you had the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So in the mind of the Russian, Moscow, right, as being a patriarchal see, they're the only ones left. Rome's dead, right? They're Catholic, so they don't believe in that. They're dead to them. Constantinople's been sacked. Right? Jerusalem and Antioch and those others that were big seats of orthodoxy early on are really not around anymore. So Moscow saw itself as a very important repository of Orthodox Christianity. So you get, that's important to remember as we're thinking about the Russian Orthodox Church. They were very, they thought themselves very the true faith. They were preserving the true faith. Even from the Greek Orthodox Church, they had some issues with them. So, all right, let's jump back on the outline here. So, in 1612, the defeat of Poland in the Battle of Moscow and the subsequent election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613 ended the times of troubles and began the Romanov dynasty. So this, what I showed you before, this all deals with the times of troubles that was in Russia. So this is a painting of the Battle of Moscow, and they were able to kick the Poles out. And this is when the nobility, the army came together and said, okay, we need some stability. And this is when they selected Mikhail Romanov. He's technically they call the first Romanov Tsar. He was actually in a convent, or in a monastery, and they had to go find him. But they looked they looked at the family line and said, okay, who has a good claim to the throne, and let's go get him. And so Mikhail was the one they got. And his father, Mikhail's election was coupled with the pronouncement of his father, his name was Filaret, as the Patriarch of Moscow, and was given the title of Great Sovereign. So there's a monument to the Battle of Moscow. Minim and Pozharsky, sorry, I'm going to butcher some of these names, I apologize. They were some of the major generals in the battle that freed Moscow. And of course, you can see where that's at. That's St. Basil's Cathedral right behind. So that's in Red Square, or in the Kremlin area. So, what else do I got here? Can you guys see that? I guess it's dark back there, but so this is just a timeline, a family line, a lineage. So there's Ivan the Terrible up there, okay, and then you can see it went this way to Fyodor II, and then a lot of stuff went on, but then they came over here. So he was married to Anastasia Romanovna, and this came down her line over here. You guys see that over there? So there's Ivan. So we went this way first. Now, after the interregnum, we're coming down here and picking up that. So Romanov comes from Anastasia's Romanovna's name there, who's the child from that. So there you go. There's Mikhail I and his father, Filaret. So back on the outline. So Filaret was really the power until his death in 1633. So about 20 years, he was the one that was guiding and directing Mikhail. The nobility and the army kind of chose Mikhail. He had a good claim to the throne, but he was also young, so he was able to be manipulated. So they wanted to have somebody they could sort of control. And then bringing in his father to help with that too, who was sympathetic to obviously he's part of the church, he's the patriarch, but he could also guide and direct as well. So this to them was a win, and it really did seal the power and consolidate and settle things down in Russia at the time. And Filaret, he kept back on the outline. He kept the nobility in check. And he did this with exile or punishment. So he had a heavy hand in terms of that. But he was very kind to the clerics, and he was a strong believer in maintaining the traditions of the Orthodox Church. So during their rule, Mikhail's and Filaret while he was alive, the cities were rebuilt. I mean, you had a lot of, civil insurrections and riots, and obviously the captivity of Moscow by the Poles. So a lot of things had to be rebuilt, and that's what they were done. And the army strengthened, so they didn't have this problem again of invading armies. They improved the economics, and the church became more controlled, was controlled more by the state, and then laws were passed that tied peasants more to the land. So Mikhail was, fairly devout. He didn't think people should be smoking tobacco, so he outlawed it. He prohibited it. Those laws on the peasants. What he did is the peasants were tied to the land. They kind of ran with the land, owned with the land, and if they ran away, there wasn't any. They kind of could be free from that if they went somewhere else. Well, he passed a law that said any runaway peasant, if they're caught and brought back or found within 10 years, were brought right back to the land. So they still were part of the land. So that's how one of the laws that was passed that tied the peasants, serfs, to the land at the time. That was what Mikhail passed. And as you know, that whole peasant serfdom type of class system is going to become extremely important as we move through Russian history. The other thing he did was built this beauty. This is the Terem Palace. It's in the Kremlin area. It was already there, but he redid it, and this is what it looks like today. And this is I believe, where the Russian presidents currently live, too, in the Terem Palace. Some other pictures of it. There's some of the inside of it. Has anybody ever been there? No? Must be our next. You've been there. Okay. It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. That's Maria. Maria came today. She's from Russia. She didn't want me to do that. All right. There's some other pictures of it. But yeah, very beautiful. This will have to be our next class trip that we plan. Yes. We like that. What do I got next? Okay. Back on the outline. Make sure I didn't miss anything on Mikhail. Okay, so this is Mikhail's son. This is Alexei Mikhailovich. And he continued his father's modernizing reforms. However, heavy taxation, government corruption, and the unpaid military gave rise to a rebellion in 1648. The rebellion was quelled, and certain taxes removed, but Alexei responded with a stricter legal code and severe penalties for those who challenged the government or the Orthodox Church. The laws also tied the peasants legally and indefinitely to the land. So you can see the progression of laws in terms of serfdom. So now, no matter where you went, indefinitely, if you were a peasant and you were trying to run away, no matter when you were found, you were brought back and you were tied to that. Tied to the land there. He was actually very pious as well, devotional. I found this very funny because, and he was very rigid in how he wanted things done in the church. And I read a little excerpt from a historian that said it was a letter like you had all these emissaries from different countries that would come in, and it was a letter about Alexei telling how pious he was, and that he would roundly curse the priest if they messed up with the liturgy. I thought, okay, he's pious, but he's cursing. Anyway, it was just interesting. So he, taxed heavy. He actually permitted tobacco so he could tax it. So I thought that was funny. I guess tobacco's okay when you can tax it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? What else do I have for you there? Okay, Patriarch Nikon. Let's get back on the outline here. So within the church, Alexei began a reform movement. And this actually caused a schism. That's the word there, S-C-H-I-S-M, schism, in the Orthodox Church. And it's actually still in effect today. Alexei continued to modernize and expand the empire until his death in 1676, which paved the way for more radical changes by future Tsars. I thought this was also funny because Alexei, even though he roundly cursed the priest, he actually prohibited profanity. He passed a law that prohibited profanity. So I bet apparently he didn't need that. So this is Patriarch Nikon, and he was a modernizing patriarch. He wanted to changed the way they were doing things. In fact, what he wanted to do was get more in line, back in line with the Greek Orthodox Church. He felt like some of the writings that had perpetuated in Russia had been corrupted, the rituals and rites, getting back to things. So he was doing that. Well, they got a backlash on this, and it's called the Old Believers that did that. I believe I have them in here. Well, there's Alexei kneeling in the cathedral with Nikon there. So here they are, the Old Believers. So these were people that rejected those reforms that they were trying to do. And there were things like they were fighting against aligning back with the Greek Orthodox Church. So remember I said the Greek Orthodox Church tried to reconcile with Rome. Well, the Old Believers felt like, well, they just disqualified themselves. The Greek Orthodox Church has disqualified themselves because they tried to reconcile with Roman Catholic Rome. So they were in their heads, no, you guys are not the true church. We are the true church. They wanted new rites and rituals, and they were fighting against Nikon's increase of power. Nikon was bringing power to himself, and they were resisting against that. In fact, Alexei, the Tsar, and Nikon have a split because Alexei didn't like the amount of power that Nikon was trying to bring to himself. And so he actually banished Alexei. Alexei banished the patriarch Nikon. At one point, Nikon comes back and walks right into the cathedral in Moscow and takes over the service. So that's the kind of guy he is. And Alexei, they took him down, he sent him away, banished him again. But here's the interesting thing. Alexei still sent him money and gifts. So, even though he didn't care for the power grab that Nikon was trying for, he still cared for him. It was just kind of interesting there. So, the schism. So, here's some of the things they fought against on those rites and rituals regarding that. So, they didn't like crossing yourself with 3 fingers instead of the traditional 2. So they were trying to change how they cross themselves. That type of deal. They argued about the correct spelling of Jesus' name. They argued about how many times they bowed. So you've got a lot of bowing going on in the liturgy of the Orthodox Church, and so they were arguing about that. And how many times you said hallelujah. So these are the things, some of the things. I know there was a little more than that, but some of that was going on. But they also wanted, there was another party that wanted to see the priests and clerics more well-educated. And this is a good thing to see that happen. And so there was that was also going on there as well. But the main stuff was trying to bring these rites and rituals back. And they believed Nikon was trying to change these things as a part of the power play, part of the power grab. So this is the persecution of the Old Believers up at the top there. That's that. They were burned at the stake, a lot of them persecuted. They were persecuted for hundreds of years in various things. Catherine the Great actually gave them a little bit of a reprieve. But there's a set of Old Believers more recent, and that's probably 100 years ago. But you can kind of see that. But this is still in effect today. There are still Old Believers. So there you go. What else do I have for you on here? Nikon, he built himself the Patriarch's Palace and the Church of the 12 Apostles. This is also in the Kremlin area. So you can kind of, I believe this is the Patriarch's Palace here, and this is the Church of the 12 Apostles over there. The gold domes are the Patriarch's Palace. So you can kind of see he commissioned this. He's creating himself a palace. So this is part of the power grab that he didn't like. Here's some, so during this time, there's just a couple of images of land that was being acquired by the Tsars, Mikhail and Alexei, during this time. So you can see some of the land they've picked up over here in the dark blue and down here in the south and east. There you go. And yeah, so that's where we end up. Kind of this give you a little different view of what Russia looks like. So you got all these khanates down here. So there's the Turkish armies and khanates from the east, from the Mongol Empire that they're fighting. Turkey's the Ottoman Empire down here. So you've got all these southern wars, and there's continual wars. As the khanates get kind of defeated and pushed back, Turkey moves in, and you're getting Turkish wars throughout the next couple hundred years, as well as, moving expansion back and west, just as people are taking land as well. But here they are in 1648 as part of those two czars' reigns. During this time, you had a lot of, as Russia was expanding, you had a lot of missionary activity being done, especially east, and a lot of the Bible being translated into those languages east. So those were things that were going on within the church at that time. One of the things Alexei did too, in terms of trying to safeguard Moscow, is if you were a non-Orthodox citizen or person that lived in the land, you couldn't live within the walls of the city. You had to live outside the walls. And so he was trying to. You can see how the church, you were identified as, and as a citizen of Russia, identified with the church. Very much in line, right? Moscow, if you were a Russian, you were an Orthodox, and that's what got, you could live within the walls at that time. You can see how closely tied and how much power the church had. Remember, they were really on par, on equal. And so that's important to recognize, because this is probably the height of the church at this point. So Alexei, he had deposed Nikon, and then the church council came in because this was a problem, and they asserted that the state had no matters in authority on the church. Okay, so the czar couldn't say much about the church. So that was the how much power the church had at this point in time, and the czar would take that. You probably can't read all of that, but just so when you get this PowerPoint slide or the slides, you can kind of see the line of succession. So Alexei is right up here at the top. This is where it starts on this particular one, and then all the reds are future czars all the way down to Nicholas II down here. But just so you have that in case you're interested, it's kind of fascinating if you like those kinds of things. Peter the Great. So back on the outline. So after Alexei's death, his son, Fyodor III, which was a son from his first marriage, reigned until he died in 1682. After a brief revolt, a joint reign was agreed upon between Ivan V, he was 16 years old, and Fyodor's younger brother, and Peter I, who was 10 years old at the time. This is a son from Alexei's second marriage. See the problem? You've got two families, the family of Fyodor III's and the family of Peter, and those families are at each other. The wives of those two families are fighting, and that became a problem for a while there in Russia, and especially during the succession. So you had Ivan's sister, Sophia, as the regent for the young czars. Okay, let's stop. So let me give you some of that. So there's some of the dates. So Fyodor, he gets in there for not very long, 6 years. And then you've got Sophia, the regent. So she's Peter's half-sister and Ivan's the fifth's full sister. Okay, so there you can see where the problems are for Peter here. And they're joint reigning. And Peter's 10 at the time. Okay. And then you've got Peter coming into full power in 1682, but really after Ivan dies, he'll get a little bit more at it. So Peter's running around. Basically, Sophia was running the country, and so Peter was doing his own thing. He loved sailing. He found an old boat, fixed it up, and would sail it on the lakes, and really enjoyed that. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. And there's another line there you can just kind of see. So here's here's the Narishkina wife, and there's Peter on that line, and then you've got the Miloslavskaya wife on this side with all of these kids, and there's Sophia and Fyodor and Ivan the Fifth there. So you can kind of catch that. Did you get all that? Good. It's in your outline there. It'll be you'll have to look at it in a little while. All right. There's Sophia. Is she pretty? A very flattering picture. And there's Peter. By the way, Peter had that painted, and he presented that to the King of England when he went. So he thought highly of himself. I thought that was funny. All right. By 1689, we're back on the outline. Peter and Sophia were vying for power. And ultimately, Peter drew enough support that Sophia retired to a convent. So the military was on Sophia's side, but the church was on Peter's side. But more and more of the military started to side with Peter until Sophia was sort of marginalized and she couldn't do anything. At one point, and this was a very palpable contest throughout these two times, you had the soldiers and citizens storming the palace because they'd heard that Ivan V had been murdered. And so they came in, and then Sophia brought them both out and showed them and said, no, they're both alive. But they proceeded to actually go in and murder some of Peter's family. The military did. So you had a lot of scary stuff going on. He didn't know if he was going to die at that point in time when that happened. But eventually he was able to kind of earn enough support that she went out. Now, something to note about Russian princesses, they didn't go out in public. They were confined to the palace. They didn't show themselves. So Sophia really coming out of this cloistering within the palace was a huge deal. And she was an effective ruler. She did some great things. In fact, Catherine the Great, in her kind of memoirs, praises Sophia for what she did and how, in that time and what happened. So she was stern, but not, I want to give her, fair warning from what other people have said about her as well. All right. Some fun facts about Peter the Great. I thought this was fun. He was 6'7". I don't know if you knew that. Very tall. He loved to practice dentistry. So Peter was all about technology, modernization, and things like that. So he had a set of dental tools, and he would go around the palace. Do not be the noble that said, "Oh, I've got a toothache," because Peter would work on it. You didn't want that, I don't think. Probably loved pulling teeth. At any rate, he loved to practice dentistry. He would do mock battles, loved military stuff, and things like that, but he'd do it with live ammo. A lot of his friends died because of this. He loved ships. That didn't come out right. He loved ships and shipbuilding. And this was very important. He actually built the first Russian Navy, which really helped them in acquiring more land, especially out west and south on the Black Sea. So anyway, and of course he embraced Western modernism. In fact, he embraced the Western culture so much that he wanted everybody to shave their beards. Now, in Russia, at that time, having your beard, that was pride. That was a thing, and it may still be, I don't know, but it was a prideful thing, and he wanted them to shave their beards. But you could keep it if you had paid a beard tax. And this is the beard tax token. You see the little beard there, the mustache and the beard. You wore that around your neck, and that showed that you had paid your beard tax. He was even known to go and cut the beards of nobles. So he wanted them to wear Western dress, from France, and so that's what Peter was about. Okay, let me get back on here. So Peter, back on the outline, he was fascinated with the military and especially naval vessels, and he used both to expand Russian land holdings. Peter was also intrigued by his foreign friends and the modern ideas they brought from Europe. Peter was relentless in modernizing Russia and embarked on the Great Embassy, or the Grand Embassy as it's sometimes called, in 1697 to 1698, to seek out new technology and to strengthen and make new diplomatic ties. So this is a map up here of the Great Embassy, or the Grand Embassy that he took. The black is the way he went out and got all the way to London. He was known in this period of time to roll up his sleeves and get in the shipyards, and he was helping build ships both in the Netherlands and in England. The King of England gave him a small ship that he brought back. They had sailed back, but you can kind of see that. He also was, when I was saying strengthening diplomatic ties, the Habsburg Empire, he was trying to strengthen their treaty and their alliance. Not as well done in terms of that on the political side, but he brought a lot of stuff back. He created chests and chests of new equipment and things that he got. He went to the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and brought back some of the equipment he was given, and from there he then brought people back, shipbuilders and other people. He hired them to come to Russia and help with that as well. So he from that standpoint, he was really trying to bring Russia into the up to speed. You got to remember now, because of where Russia is and how big it is, there was a lot of disconnect, in this area here. These were contested lands. You'd have the Austrian Empire taking some of it, and then the Polish Empire taking some of it. You had the Swedes coming down from the top, taking land from there. So all these lands were contested for a long time, and really created a barrier from Russia to the rest of Western Europe. So a lot of the things that were happening in Western Europe, the Renaissance, really did not happen in Russia until much later, when some of the peace was established through there, and and then Peter's bringing people over. So there was a lot of isolation going on in terms of what was happening in culture. So, yeah. I thought I'd take a stop here. We haven't talked about the Kremlin area, but there it is on the Moscow River and how it's shaped. Just a couple of different photos. Peter added to the Kremlin area. There's just a more modern, tourist outlay of it, just to show you some of the buildings. And there obviously is a modern aerial view of that as well. Peter built the arsenal. You can see the big cannons down there on there. This is one of the buildings he had built. Okay, we'll leave it there for a second. Where did I leave you? When Peter returned, he began a militant westernizing campaign, reforming all manner of Russian life, and none more so than the church. Up there on the street, on the slide, is Patriarch Adrian. He was the last patriarch at this time. So Peter, he abolished the taxational privilege of the church. Taxational. And when the patriarch died in 1700, that's when Patriarch Adrian here died, he didn't appoint a replacement. Instead, he placed the church under control of the monastery department, and then taking control of all revenue of the church. He promoted churchmen who preached the absolute authority of the Tsar and made bishops take an oath of obedience to the Tsar. And then, about 21 years later, he abolished the patriarch completely, even though there wasn't one there, no lead there, and he placed the church under the control of a holy synod led by a chief procurator that was appointed by the Tsar. This led to the weakening of the church's position. The church became more of a closed, and access to the clergy from other social classes was limited. All clergy virtually became government officials. This was a state-run church at this point. The synod period of the church would last until the revolution. In fact, they were able to, after the Bolshevik Revolution, they were actually brought back the patriarch, elected a new patriarch, but that's Pastor Pete's next week. His military reforms allowed Russia to expand the empire in all directions. Connecting Russia to the West was a primary goal for proximity to Europe, as we talked about, and warm water seaports. For a long time, Russia did not have any warm water seaports, or seaports that were accessible all year round. They had some up in the north that were frozen in the wintertime and only accessible during the summer, warmer months periods. So when Peter captured the Neva Delta in 1703, he began planning a great seaport city. And we'll get to that in a second. But some more, there's Neva there, the Neva Delta and the city that he built. St. Petersburg, it was built, and Peter moved his family there in 1710. So for about 7 or 8 years, he built St. Petersburg. They imported stone to do this. There was no stone. Most of the early buildings, like in Moscow, were all done in wood with plaster coverings or things like that on it. And this, as you probably know, it was a very marshy area. So the ability to get it to building where you could actually have some firm ground took a lot of work, a lot of labor. Tens of thousands of serfs and peasants were killed during this time. Even soldiers pressed into service. They used prisoners and prisoners of war and political prisoners for labor during this time. I mean, it was. It's a great feat, but the cost was at a huge human cost of lives. People died of starvation, disease. You had a marshy swamp area, so mosquitoes, malaria, things like that were common in terms of killing the people that were working on the area there. So there's just an outside lay. Now there's one of the palaces he built, the Menshikov Palace. That's the very first building would have been off to the right. This became adjoined to it, but right on the Neva River there. There's another one. That's the Kunstkamera Museum. And then you had the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral. That's a fort. It's within a fort area there. That was the first thing they built to protect the area in that. What else do I have there? Oh, the Peterhof Palace, of course. Yeah. Amazing. So you can see all the gardens in the back there, but look at the front. You can see I don't know if you've seen the fountain areas of this. Phenomenal. 100 fountains within this area. And it's all run on a natural spring. So the pressure from the natural spring is what powers this, and they turn it on at particular times during the day when the pressure builds up. Very interesting. Kind of cool. But he would bring in architects from Italy and other places to build these things and design them. Back on the outline, Peter married his second wife, Catherine, in St. Petersburg in 1712. He named St. Petersburg as the new capital of Russia. In 1721, Peter declared Russia an empire. And of course, if it's an empire, well, he's the first emperor. So all you have to do is declare that you have an empire. I have the Wertin Empire down in San Clemente. Therefore, I'm Emperor J. There you go. I can do it too, Peter. Anyway, Peter died in 1725 without naming an heir, which of course left a struggle for succession. Just before we get to the next kind of role here, I'll just show you some more territory that was a lot of wars. I'm trying to focus on church and sort of some of the political things that would be pertinent to religion and the church, but and also just historically to kind of move us along. But lots of wars during this time, that they were having, and we just don't have time to talk about all of them. But I'm trying to show you some of the lands and territories that were acquired through some of these wars at the end of a lot of these rulers' reigns. So the dark area, this is kind of the north area. You can see what he picked up: Estonia, Livonia, and carving into the Swedish Empire as well there. And then down down south, around the Black Sea, you can see what he's picked up there as well. So just to give you a little idea of what lands he picked up. And that also, through this period, there were, as he's conquering new lands and Russia is growing, there are financial and political incentives for the rulers of those areas to convert to Orthodoxy and to bring their people with them. So he is trying to bring the church along in terms of tying people to Russia through religion. And so there were incentives to do that. All right. Catherine the Great. I'm spending time mostly on Peter and Catherine because the most significant changes in the church were during these two reigns. And so we're going to spend a little time, and they're very interesting rulers too. So let's jump back on the outline. After Peter the Great's death, the military and government took control and were instrumental in selecting Tsars at this point. And a 37-year period saw 6 different Tsars come to power before Catherine II seized control through a coup d'etat from her husband, Peter II. All right, let's stop there for just a second. So here's the continuation of the Romanov dynasty. So after Peter, Catherine I took over. That was his wife. And then that was only for 2 years. And then Peter II. And then you have Anna for 10 years. Ivan VI for a year. Elizabeth for 20 years. And then Peter III. And then, of course, Catherine II. So Peter III was Catherine II's husband. All right. There's Catherine with her new crown. So here's Catherine over here. All right. So this is her husband. There's Peter the Great. I'm sorry, Catherine I is right here. Then Elizabeth. So here's Catherine II. So she's a Prussian princess. All right. So she's not even from Russia. She marries Peter III, and within a year, has plotted against him and taken over the crown from him. He gets killed shortly after that, which, doesn't look like it was her plan. I read conflicting reports on that. Let's just put it that way. She probably wasn't unhappy to see it happen because now her claim is much stronger. Although it's a weak claim, all right? And I actually wrote that here, so let's get back on the outline. Though she had a weak claim to the throne as a Prussian wife to a nephew of the previous Empress Elizabeth, I know that was a mouthful, but Elizabeth is right here. She was in for 20 years. It was a relatively peaceful time, and her reign was characterized by what people would call excessiveness. She ate a lot, had a lot of parties, things like that. But very interesting. but we're not here to talk about Elizabeth. So Peter is her son, and Catherine there. So that you got all that. So Catherine the Great, highly skilled politically, and obviously cunningly strategic, as she, managed to get the military to take her husband out. Now, her husband didn't do himself any favors. Peter III didn't do himself any favors. He was making reforms that the military didn't like, and they were not real thrilled with him anyhow. And it probably didn't hurt that many of Catherine's lovers were high-ranking military officers. So we'll just leave that at that. But once she got into power, she quickly secured her position through popular laws and reforms. She projected a very an enlightened and progressive Russia to the world, and she embraced all things Russian, including Orthodoxy. But that didn't stop her from actually nationalizing all the church lands in 1764. So, we'll get to this in a second. So, Peter took all of the taxational money that the church was getting and took it into himself. Catherine said, I'm going to take the lands. And so she took all of the church lands. She closed down monasteries. She put priests on small salaries. And that forced many of them to become farmers and then also churchmen for hire. So they would do things like charge fees for baptisms and marriages. Catherine did a lot of reading. She read a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers and corresponded with Voltaire. I was reading some of the letters they wrote back and forth to each other. But she was reading Montesquieu and other Enlightenment authors of that, like that. She attempted to create a commission in which all classes of people were represented and proposed a new code of laws called the Bolshoi Nakaz, or the Great Instruction. And that's her painting of her writing the Bolshoi Nakaz, and that's one of the copies of it. That's actually, as you can see, is in French. That it was not only written in Russian, but it was also translated into French and English as well. So it was that important. She sent that to Voltaire, and he really liked it. But what this did is she cared about the state. She cared about the state. She cared about Russia. She saw her job as improving the people and their livelihoods. She believed the authority of the state should be used to regulate and improve morality, public health, and commerce. And that was what was trying to be happening here. In fact, the first version of this included freedom for the serfs. So she was trying to free all the serfs. Now remember, up to this point, the nobility and the military were the ones, and the government were the ones that were kind of placing Tsars on the throne. She was able to get on there, but she was still beholden to the nobility. So as much as she wanted to free all the serfs, she recognized that she wasn't going to be able to do that very easily because the nobles were going to get angry, and that, So you look at some of these czars, they'll tell you, you'll see documentaries or read things like they had absolute power, some of these czars. And in some cases, they did have a lot of power to a point until you started to get, the nobility or the army mad at you with what you did, and then they weren't opposed to, as we can see, taking a czar down. And so she had to walk this fine line of trying to be progressive and to try and care for the people of her country, because 90% of the population were serfs. So this was a huge problem, and she saw the problem because it couldn't continue this way. Especially when you looked across the 1700s in Western Europe at the revolts and revolutions that were happening in many of the countries. I mean, look when she reigned, 1762 to 1796. 1789 is the French Revolution, okay? She's communicating with Voltaire. She knows what's going on, and so she doesn't want the same thing to happen in her country. And so she's trying to do some good things. in terms of how they were treated. One of the things, this is a kind of funny cartoon, but those are the inoculation people for smallpox. So this is kind of a cartoon of it, but that's her in the background, Catherine the Great. She got inoculated for smallpox. So this was a brand new thing. Dimsdale was a doctor from England who had developed an inoculation. Now it involved cutting your part of your body open and infecting you with a small bit of smallpox. So, you could die if it didn't go right. So she did it in secret for her and her son Paul, and then once it worked, she then announced to the world that she had been inoculated for smallpox, and so did a lot of other Russians after that point. So things like that, she was trying to help her people. Good thing. So she's trying to do the Bolshoi Nakaz, trying to change the structure of life in Russia, and so they're having talks about it and having discussions, and these commissions were coming together. So they were trying to make progress in this regard. And in regard to the serfs, she actually had an essay writing contest about what should we do with the serfs? How should we handle the serfs? Trying to gauge where people were at with this, with freeing the serfs. Unfortunately, back on the outline here, ultimately war with Turkey, one of many, hindered these talks and were never resumed. So she tried, but it just, more pressing matters got in the way. But Catherine did have a concern for the people of Russia and was able to improve education. She had religious tolerance for non-Orthodox, non-Christians, the old believers in that group too, and Jews who lived in Russia. So the old believers were double taxed up until this time. She actually removed that. But you can see what, the old believers who didn't want to go with the reforms of the Orthodox Church, they were persecuted, in many different ways, not just killed and burned on the burned at the stake like you saw those other ones, but they were double taxed and they were marginalized in every way you could think of. Catherine was concerned about the peasants, as 90% of the population were serfs, as I said earlier, but was more fearful of the nobility, whom she appeased to accomplish her goals. She died in November of 1796, fearful of the revolution spreading across Europe, and fearful of an heir that would not carry on her work. She had a very progressive mind. She wanted to see this done. She knew that her son Paul was not, of the same mind as her. Paul was raised by somebody else. He was not happy about the role his mom played in his father being, ousted and then killed. And so they were very estranged from one another. So there you go. This is just one, illustration of Russian society in the class system. But you can have that just to see where things were at there. She did have the Winter Palace. The Winter Palace has been built and rebuilt and upgraded and expanded over the years, but she did a lot of this. She had a very classical view of architecture and culture. She wanted to bring that stuff in, so she had this done. The Winter Palace is now the Hermitage Museum, but unbelievable. I have more. So she paid homage to Peter the Great. That's a bronze statue of him. And of course, she didn't forget to leave her name off of the bottom there, Peter and Catherine. Catherine's name actually looks a little bit bigger, doesn't it, in the writing? I don't know, maybe. And then you can see the Peter and Paul Cathedral behind there in the background. She built the Towered Palace. I think that's how you pronounce it. And then also during her time, more land was picked up as well. So I just, in the blues there. And down south, Crimea, so on and so forth. This is a good time to stop as we're done with Catherine there. So the Orthodox Church, if you've ever, some of you probably have been to an Orthodox church service, or have been in maybe an Orthodox church where you saw a service going on. But a couple of things that you might find different about the Orthodox Church is, one, the cross that they have. You see they've got a 3-barred cross, and the top bar would be the sign that was put over Jesus' cross there. We see it, King of the Jews, what was on there. Now you see it as INRI a lot. And of course, the crossbar that his arms were on. And then the bottom cross is where his feet were. Now, it's tilted. The idea there is if Jesus were hanging on that cross, his right side, the tilt would be, the upper portion would be up to his right side. Some say pointing to heaven, the other side pointing to hell. There's other traditional thoughts that it was pointing to the thief that repented, and the other one is pointing to the thief. The downside is pointing to the thief that didn't repent. But anyway, a couple of things there. But there's the traditional Russian Orthodox cross. The middle image is a censer, CENSOR, and so they would burn incense in that, and you'd see them swinging that to cover the different areas of the church. And those are the prayers of the people going up to God in the smoke of that. And you see the bells that are on there. So there's 4 chains that come down, and each chain has 3 bells, so a total of 12 altogether. And those represent the 12 apostles. And when they ring, it's kind of the voice of the apostles going on, speaking to us. So you hear that as they're swinging the censer to the different areas of the church. And then bells. Now that's the Tsar bell there. It's one of the biggest bells ever made. It was never rung, but there it is. But bells in the Orthodox Church chime the different segments of the liturgy. And so you've always got bells going on in the Orthodox Church. So just some of the things that we may not be familiar with, but we want to bring out in terms of the Orthodox Church liturgy. Also, so remember how I said the church clerics and priests, they became almost like government employees at this point. And there was a movement in the church because it felt very sterile and, antiseptic and very rigid, that there was no feeling to it. There was a movement in the Optina monastery, was the big place, of a getting back to the spiritual side of orthodoxy. And so you had the guy on the left there, or on the right, is a starret. There's a different name. That's a shortened name for it, but I can't pronounce the Russian name for it. But they were these traveling wise men, holy men, and you can see he's kind of raggedy, but they had spiritual powers. They could heal people. So there's probably some mendicant sort of medicine type of aspect to them as well. But there. And one famous one that you'll recognize is Rasputin. He was one of these starets, and he was intimate with Nicholas II and his family, whom we'll get to within the next 4 minutes. And then also Father Zosima, which was one of the characters in the Brothers Karamazov, which we talked about earlier this year. He is based on these starets. And so there's that spiritual movement that they felt like, they were missing something in all of these changes in the government taking over of the church through Peter, and then even more so through Catherine. So just to kind of bring you up to speed with what's going on there. So in the next 3 minutes, we're going to go through 6 19th century czars. Ready, go! I actually ended up grouping all these together for one reason, is there didn't appear to be very many changes in the Orthodox Church, but I wanted to kind of give us a history of what was going on so I can bring us up to the Revolution, and so onward and upward. There's a little timeline. Paul, the Tsar from Catherine's son, and then how it went down from there. Alexander Nicholas, Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas II. And there they are. All right, so Catherine's son Paul, he became Tsar in 1796. His short reign was characterized by censorship, military discipline, and a police state, which led to his overthrow and murder in 1801. His son Alexander was aware of the planned overthrow, but murder was not intended. Alexander gave tacit approval to his father's overthrow. There is a one thing I read, that the people that were coming in to take Paul down and to overthrow him were actually carrying papers of abdication that they wanted him to sign. So death may not have been what was going on. So anyway, there you go. Now you know the rest of the story. Alexander II, he was 1801 to 1825. He spent much of his early time dealing with the Napoleonic Wars. He did bring in the Bible Society. So he'd been to England, saw what the Bible Society was doing, and he brought them in to distribute Bibles in the Russian language. So that was one thing he did. Unfortunately, at the end of his reign, he was urged by an Orthodox monk to dismiss them. During his reign, he attempted to bring change to Russia while still holding on to the imperial prerogative of rule. All these Tsars were trying to deal mainly with the serf issue. This becomes the unrest is becoming more and more. Unfortunately, most of their these six guys, their Tsars, their answer to this was to press the thumb down even harder, trying to get that autocracy. Even when they gave independence, they still retained a lot of their autocratic rule for it. These are some of the things that happened during this time, the Napoleonic War, Austerlitz and Borodino. So Alexander I, he fought in the Napoleonic Wars. He was defeated at Austerlitz pretty badly, but was able to, I call it a win at Borodino. It was a tie, but it was basically a win for the Russians because the French lost a lot of their men, and then they were stuck deep in Russia. And this is when, after this war, they're trying to make their way back out, and they just got harried all the way out. You never fight a land war in Asia. Don't fight a land war in Asia. So he got caught in the winter. In fact, Napoleon lost hundreds of thousands of his men on the way to Moscow before this time. And so it was really a difficult decision. In fact, Alexander I made it all the way. He marched, as they were pushing Napoleon back, he marched all the way into Paris. And didn't do what Napoleon did to Moscow, which was burn it. And try and blow up a lot of the buildings in the Kremlin, but he told the Parisians that they were, we're not going to inflict the same kind of damage that Napoleon did to us, and we will honor a new constitution that you get. Well, now you got his soldiers and his officers who are saying, wait, we want a new constitution back home, Alexander. You're allowing them to have it. So, just tensions continue to grow there. The December revolt was also during Nicholas I. Right after Alexander died, Nicholas became the Tsar. You had an uprising. Again, the same kinds of things. He also dealt with the November uprising, which was Poles revolting in Russian territory, and the Crimean War. Sale of Alaska. Just thought I'd throw that in there for you. Just kind of see when that happened. The Trans-Siberian Highway in 1891 it began, finished in 1916. You had the Marxist Socialist Party formed in 1898. 1905, the Russo-Japanese Wars. Russia got their hat handed to them in that one. Lost a lot of their naval ships as well during that. You had the Bloody Sunday and Russian Revolution in 1905. World War I began, and then 1917 you had the February Revolution, and then the Bolshevik Revolution. Sorry, that was fast. There's a picture of Austerlitz, Alexander II. There's a Battle of Borodino in 1812, also Alexander. December's revolt. So they came into the Kremlin, and they shot him. They just shot him down. It was violently set down there. I believe I have it on here. Alexander I had designated his brother Nicholas, 1825 to 1855, so he reigned for 30 years, as his heir. And when he became Tsar, Nicholas I was immediately confronted with the Decembrist uprising. These were soldiers and officers that had served abroad and exposed to various forms of government. They believed that the key to Russian progress was a new constitution and freedom for the serfs. So, as I mentioned, they had a chance in all these countries to see the different forms of government and what was going on, so they wanted the same thing. Nicholas quelled the uprising and then governed with high vigilance. So he was on guard. He didn't want this to happen again. And unfortunately, a lot of discipline and a lot of repression. Upon his death, his son, Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, he became Tsar. Alexander II started out with progressive reforms highlighted by the liberation of the serfs. This was a very important one. So they were free to go. However, they didn't go as well as planned. He had revolts, uprisings, and talks of revolution became common. He also had to deal with a Pole uprising in Russia, caused the Tsar to enact Russification measures. So all their history, religion, and culture other than Russian was banned. And Alexander II, he was plagued by a number of assassination attempts, which ultimately, assassination, that's the word there, yeah, which ultimately led to his death in 1881. So he liberated the serfs. Now, the serfs had the opportunity to buy land. Of course, the nobles were selling the land to the serfs, and they were selling it at unfair prices. They were able to take out loans for the land from the government, but now they're beholden to the government. So it was a nice step, but it didn't really do much. It didn't help like it meant to. And then Alexander, they were not happy with him. So he had numerous assassination attempts. He was finally killed in a bomb was set under his carriage. Didn't kill him at that time. He got out to see and confront the guy that was trying to kill him, and then another bomb was thrown, almost like a hand grenade type thing, and he died from that. All right. Yeah, November uprising. Okay. So let's get back on here. Nicholas II. I already passed over him, but he had to deal with the Crimean War. So England and France allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russia because they were not happy about all the gains Russia was making in land holdings. They thought they were becoming too powerful. So they had to fight the Crimean War, and didn't go well for them, for Russia down there. Trans-Siberian Highway. Okay. So his son Alexander III, who became Tsar after his dad was assassinated, he felt that the reforms his father had implemented weakened the monarchy. He reversed many of the laws and ruled by repression and a heavy hand. During his tenure, the alliances with the European powers slowly fell apart until Russia was completely isolated by the end of his reign. They lost a lot of those alliances. Was not good for them. He did start the laying track for the railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. One of the reasons they lost the Crimean War is they had no internal transportation. Everything had to be carried in by hand. There were no way to get troops down there through trains like the Western countries had. They were able to move and bring in things, weapons, soldiers very easily. And Russia was just always behind in the modernization aspect of what was going on in the world. So Alexander III, his hatred of Poles and Jews led to violent persecutions of both. And Alexander III tightened his father's Russification laws regarding religion, so allowing only, I misspelled that, only the Orthodox Church. So that was the only religion you were allowed to have. So remember Catherine, she was very tolerant of other religions, not so now. So the response to rising tensions and revolution was to press down even further on them. Alexander III's health deteriorated after being injured in a train derailment, and he died in 1894. The train derailment was actually his fault. He was mad about how slow the train was going, so he told him to speed up. Anyway, so there's some of the land that was acquired during this time, during this period of these czars. So his son, Nicholas II, the last czar, 1894 to 1917, he was. They call him a reluctant czar. He didn't really care to be taking control, and was very ill prepared for the weight of the office and the coming events, as we know what's coming. He promoted an autocratic rule in the face of rising reform and revolutionary sentiments. The 1905 revolution was violently crushed. There's the 1905 revolution. That bottom lower left picture, he just shot into the crowds and killed a lot of people. They didn't like that. So it was violently crushed, but it forced Nicholas to allow a lot of governmental reforms. So within the reforms, unfortunately, the Tsar still maintained much of the control, so they were very shadowy reforms. But the new ministers and departments managed to temporarily appease most of the populace's revolutionary impulses. Unfortunately, World War I upset any progress that was being made. Russian losses, food shortages, and hyperinflation during this time resulted in the 1917 revolution, which forced their abdication, Nicholas II's abdication, and his imprisonment of him and his family. And then later that year, the Bolsheviks took control of the provisional government in October of 1917, and Nicholas II and his family were executed in July of 1918. So there's Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and then there's Nicholas and his family. Terrible time, revolutionary time. I didn't spend a lot of time during that because that is next week's Christianity and Revolution when Pastor Pete will get going. But let me pray for you and get you on your way. So please pray with me. Father God, thank you for this chance to take a quick look at the Orthodox Church in Russia. God, it is good to see how, even amidst all of these major world events and repression and oppression and changes, your church still does survive through that, as you have promised it will. Thank you for this time to look at it, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.